Has expired.
Mr Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, what balderdash we just heard from the Agriculture Minister for National. Mr Speaker, the reason that the National Government is passing this legislation is that the practice that they wanted to adopt under the prior law was illegal. That's why they've changed the law. To accuse myself and Helen Clark of acting improperly when we were just enforcing the law seems a little bit unusual to me as a legislator. Well, actually, I will deal with some of the points that you raised because your understanding of the issues is obviously flawed. Mr Speaker, when I became Minister, the cry of the Pastoral Lessees was that they wanted the government not to force them into tenure review and to respect their rights under statutory leases. And I was at a meeting just actually the weekend before last where someone came up to me and said, "Oh, I remember that first meeting with you," speaking of myself, as then Minister of Land Information, when you had that first meeting with the Pastoral Lessees. And I remember them saying to me on behalf of the government, "Please respect the lessees' rights under the pastoral leases." And my response to them was, "Yes, I will." And they said, "Please don't force us into tenure review." And I said, "I agree, I won't." And I said, "And my duty as the Minister is to enforce the statutory lease on behalf of the lessor, because that's who the Crown is, and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to only accept tenure review outcomes where I think they're in the Crown's interest, and I'm going to do that." That's all I did. I enforced the law. Seems pretty novel to the National Party that you might do that, but that's all I did. That's all I did. Now, it is true that the value of some of these properties has gone up hugely. Actually, when the value of properties normally goes up, rents normally follow. That's what happens in the private sector. In fact, Mr Carter, I think you might own a property or two, and occasionally when the value goes up, I think you might put the rent up. Oh, but not when you're Minister of Land and you've got custody of these properties on behalf of the Crown and a voting section of your population. What you do then is you put the rent down for your mates. Now, if this was a point of principle as to why you were doing this, I could understand it. But there are other mechanisms that could be used to address this. Now, what we in the Labour Party found was that some of these rents were ridiculously low. I'll give you one example. We had complaints from someone who had a big station in the Kaiburn area. They said it was worth millions of dollars, that high country runoff grazing, to their lowland farm. How much rent do members think they were paying for this thing that they said was worth millions of dollars to the value of their lowland farm? Less than $1,500 per annum, $1,500 per annum plus GST, less than that. I think it was about $1,250 plus GST. It was an absurdly low rent. So when I was Minister and we had some issues that need to be resolved in the High Country, I thought, well, I'll apply the law. So we got some valuation advice. Turned out we actually had inconsistent valuation practice, and some people were getting rents set on one basis and some people were getting rents set on another basis. So I took advice from Crown Law and I said, what's the correct basis to set rents? And I then instructed the department to assess rents on that basis. These rents are set according to a statutory formula. Not 10% of the value, not 5% of the value. 2% of the land value excluding improvements. Improvements are excluded because they're already the property of the lessee. But the lessor is entitled to rent under the current law, which is changed by this bill, at 2% of the land value excluding improvements if paid on time. Now, when we did that, we found that some of these properties are being purchased by people who are not buying them for pastoral values alone. People are paying sometimes $10 million for these properties because they are postcard properties. They're picture postcard properties on the edge of lakes. They're on the edges of lakes Wakatipu, Wanaka, Hawea, Tekapo, Ohau, Pukaki. People who are very, very wealthy are on occasions buying these properties as effectively giant holiday homes, and sometimes they're being run as timeshares where a number of wealthy people own fractional interests in these properties and they're effectively using them as a giant holiday home. And they purchased them knowing that the rent was 2%. They purchased them knowing that the rent was 2% of the land value excluding improvements. Now, in respect of those people, I don't think they should get a rent discount. I don't think they should. But there are other people who should. There are some farmers who only extract pastoral values, and as Mr Carter has said, they've owned these farms for generation upon generation, and they can't afford to pay the high rent. I have always acknowledged that. The government, when the Labor government was in, we acknowledged that. I wrote to every one of those lessees personally. I can remember what a boring job it was, signing out 236 letters or whatever it was to these people, and I did it twice. And I wrote to each of them. I wrote to each of them and said, if you cannot afford to pay the rent, please come to us and we will negotiate a discount. We went and we wrote to every one of them. We said, look, sometimes there are problems of access to adjacent rivers and lakes that we want to sort out, because then some of these properties surround lakes and there is no decent access for New Zealanders to go through these properties to get to the lakeside. And I wanted to regularise access so that New Zealanders can access their lakes and rivers. I also said that there are occasions where we want to stop wilding pines spreading, and we might like some wilding pine control, or at least access onto the land to control the spread of those wilding pines. Now, we also said explicitly in this letter, I've still got copies of the letter and I remember writing them, if you've got an excessive rent that you can't afford, and we don't need access to a river or lake, and we don't need wilding pine control, well, we'll give you the rent discount anyway if you can't afford to pay. Now, the lessees, they chose to say, well, they wouldn't engage in this debate because it was coming to the end of our third term, and they thought they'd take their chances on being able to delay this long enough so that the government would change and they could go through the back door and see that Duke, Mr Carter, who would, in the face of a $13 billion deficit, give up on rents to multi-millionaires who paid these prices knowing that the rent was 2% of the land. It's not envy. It's not envy. It's a fact. It's a fact. And if someone, and let's take the example of Shania Twain's partner, Mutt Lang. Purchased a property up near, up in central Otago, Soho Station, and he's actually done some very good conservation work. He's done some very good work up there, and farms the property very well. But do we really think that we should be giving that person a discount when they paid many millions of dollars for that property, knowing that the rent was 2% of the land value excluding improvements? Now, what Mr Carter says is a bit like saying that the rent for a commercial property in Remuera ought to be the same as a rent for a commercial property in South Auckland. That's the logic that he's using. It is a nonsense, because the two properties are of different values. And the law said that they should be paying rent on the basis of land value excluding improvements. Now, Mr Carter, the other thing I would say is I would take you back to that original meeting that I recounted to you where the lessees said they were fearful that the government, they actually put this to me, they said, please don't change the law on us. It's terrible, this is sacrosanct, don't change the law. And they were fearful, and this was in the newspapers at the time, that the Labor government would change the law and that would be somehow interfering with their private property right. Well, actually what Mr Carter is doing is opening Pandora's box here, because he is legislating to interfere with the Crown's property right in these leases. And once that key is turned and that door is opened, it has consequences in the future, and it will have those consequences. Mr O'Connor said, yes, income-related rents are fine for those people that need them. And we've said that. I've actually explained the letters that I wrote to similar effects to the lessees. But people that don't need them, who've paid multi-million dollars for these properties, knowing that the rent was 2% of land value excluding improvements, ought not to be given a discount, particularly when you're running a $13 billion deficit like this government is, and the rent the deficit is worse as a consequence of this bill. Finally, Mr Speaker, can I say that there's never ever been any hatred from this side of the House to the lessees. I value that heritage farming, that historic practice in the high country. I actually think lessees protect against over-development of the land. I don't think all these leases should be forced into tenure review, but it does flow through to tenure review outcomes in a way that is
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Call Shane Arden.
It's a pleasure to rise tonight and speak.